started my career in tech here actually at a seed and Series A startup called Soko, which is basically Airbnb for commercial warehousing and chief of staff. Also worked on actually a Series A fundraise at the time. We raised about $3 million. Separately, currently I work at a corporate venture studio called Moon Creative Lab. We're based in Omotesando, affiliated with Mitsubishi & Co. Separate, actually, you will know before everybody at my company, I just quit my job last week. So I am a free man and on the market in a number of ways. But I also run a startup community called Startup Co-Creation. It's about 500 people in a Slack. Mostly me posting articles that I foolishly think are good and interesting, and people, reacting to that politely. I also, do a Substack newsletter called Adventure in Japan. Please subscribe, look up. Happy to share the link later. Try to actually basically, help people stay informed of funding rounds, relevant news, whatever is happening in the world of venture startups here. In English turnout, that was a pretty big gap, and kind of dovetails with a lot of the increased foreign interest in Japan these days, which I think we'll talk about. But yeah, great to meet you and happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Evan Burkosky. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, and I've been in Japan for 21 years now. It's been a little while. Wow. Thank you. I came when I was pretty young, and it was originally because, well, as you probably know, in Western Canada, we catch a lot of seafood that's imported to Japan, and that was my family business. I was a third-generation commercial fisherman by trade. My original career path was fishboat captain, and I came to Japan with the intention to try to create more direct import routes and then market Canadian seafood. I'd studied marketing in school, and I had this big idea that I was going to, optimize trade routes and all this stuff. I worked with Jetro for a while during the first year while I was on a working holiday program, and I ran up against a lot of protectionism and pretty, well, unions that were not very receptive to change. And I thought, well, that business idea probably won't work, but this is really interesting, this concept of trying to bridge Japan and the rest of the world, because it felt like an alternate universe. Disconnected from the rest of the world, but somehow still connected, grudgingly, sort of. And it was just an exciting place. In 2003, it was a vibrant place. It was pretty interesting. A lot was going on. And yeah, I was kind of hooked. So I taught English like everybody does. And then after a year of doing that, I thought, well, I never really liked working for other people, so I'll start my own English school. That went pretty well for a few years. I made some money doing that, but I couldn't scale that business beyond a certain point. And I thought, well, let's do something related to the internet that's going to be more scalable. So I co-founded a marketing agency, just totally boutique marketing agency. We did web development and SEO and ran ad campaigns and all sorts of stuff. Through that process, we got the idea for a SaaS business, and we spun that off. Rose, a round of angel financing for that. It got some traction for a few years. But the 2011 earthquake put a big dent in the travel business, and so we wound that down eventually, and I had to go work for somebody else. So I went and worked for agency side, one of the big three. I was siloed with one of the smaller companies inside one of the big three media agencies. And during that process, I realized that there was a lot of interesting tech that I could bring to the Japanese market. While at the agency, I started reaching out to Silicon Valley and later Tel Aviv companies I thought would be a good fit for the market, and then we built teams to bring them to market. And I had the opportunity to go to Silicon Valley quite a lot, and Tel Aviv, and really learn from the best. I got to sit in on the training with a lot of companies that were at that rocket ship status, where they were really taking off, and they were getting great guest speakers in. And I learned concepts like how to run, a sales pipeline and what SDR to AE to CS functions should look like. And then I started to try and bring that to the Japanese market and found that they were not a fit. And so I had to hybridize that and understand how to bring these go-to-market strategies to the Japanese market and go through the process of nemawashi and bingisho and all of the layers of complexity. And then I thought that I had that pretty well patented, essentially, that go-to-market strategy. So I became country manager or sales director for a couple of these tech startups. And I did that for several years. I then did a stint at the deepest, most corporate Japanese company imaginable, where it was the opposite end of the startup spectrum. And I really did my best to put in my time. I committed to 3 years, and I lasted for 1 year.
Deep undercover.
Everything that they did was against my core ethos, so it was painful every moment, but I learned so much. It was extremely valuable. And then, as of April 1st, I have taken my latest startup out of stealth mode. We are now building a decisioning intelligence platform to try to make decisioning better, try to solve some of these problems. So I hope that was a useful recap and gives you some foundation for what I've been doing for 21 years now.
Cool. As the Fisher family, is it true that Norway was instrumental in making salmon sushi a big thing?
Yes, that's true. Originally, it was salmon runs in northern Japan and Hokkaido, and then concepts like ikura, and actually salmon used in sushi, that's more of a Russian concept, and it was imported by Ainu traders, because during Japan's closed period in the north, the traders were the Ainu. They had ocean-going canoes, and they were running trade routes back and forth between Russia. But during the Edo period, people didn't eat salmon as sushi. That wasn't until about the 70s, about the bubble period. And by that time, the supply of really good quality salmon in Russia and Alaska and Canada was starting to get a little bit expensive, and so Norway came in with their
Norway
farms.
stepped in. Cool. Sorry for the little detour. I love fishing. Nice to meet you all. My name is Tobias. I'm originally from Sweden. I spent much of my 20s in Asia, but not in Japan. So more in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Beijing. After studies, I worked in a sort of consulting investment banking setting. We helped mostly Western tech companies raise money from Asian investors, but interestingly, never Japanese investors. So we'd be meeting Korean investors, Singaporean investors, Chinese investors, Taiwanese investors. We never ever came across Japanese investors. So I thought that was just interesting. It left a mark on my mind. And then fast forward a few years, now I've spent the last 5 years back in Europe working at Katalysen Ventures. We're an early stage investor. And 2 years ago, I was at a conference in Denmark, and lots of investors, startups, and almost everyone was from the Nordics, but except for the Nordics, there were a bunch of Japanese investors there. So I started thinking, well, this is where you're hiding. I never met you guys in Asia, but you're here looking for startups in the Nordics. Why? And when I asked them why you're here, most of them said, well, it's just easier, to kind of find global startups outside of Japan. And somewhat stubbornly, I just refused to believe it, that it would be easier to, go across half the globe and go to Europe to find startups. So the last 2 years, I've been coming here rather frequently, 10 or so times, just to explore what could a foreign investor with a foreign investor's experience, expertise, network try to do in Japan. And these visits have sort of culminated in a project to try to launch a seed stage VC fund here in Japan. A few months ago, I decided to make this my main priority. We're getting close now to finalizing the team, advisors, strategic partners, and so on. We're actually headquartering this down in Kansai, because it gives us certain advantages, which maybe we'll talk more about. And we're just starting now to talk to Japanese LPs, investors, to see, are they interested in a foreigner building a VC fund in Japan? So I'll embrace that relatively new, I'm relatively new to Japan. I'll embrace that perspective tonight, and then the rest of the panel can correct my ignorance, and I'll also learn a little bit. Nice to meet you all.
well, we're gonna work together. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I come from a totally different background. I was in the U.S. military. Any vets? All right, cool.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry.
Your name,
sorry. Dr. Joe Hug. It's actually pronounced Ug because it's German last name, but I know I don't know German. Okay. Long story. I was in the military, and that's how I ended up in Japan. But prior to that, tonight I was asked what was one reason you came to Japan, and the reason was Shogun, the original Shogun, not the remake. The James Clavell book. I read it, fell in love with Japan. I wanted to come here and be a ninja. But anyways, so I was in the military and I retired. My background, 20 years I was in medicine. So I worked in anesthesiology, neurotrauma, the operating room, et cetera, and then most of the final years of my career, I was in the emergency room where I ran education and training programs, and then that's what got me into education. When I retired, I started teaching medical school, Tokyo Ikashika. I was teaching doctors and nurses, and then went back to the States, got my MBA in finance, and then got involved in that, doing consulting here. So I do lots of consulting with most of the major companies, probably the company you were in, maybe. So Sogo Shoshas, which I do a lot of research on the Sogo Shoshas, I have contact with them, and we often ask them for assistance in the research that I do. Speaking of my research, so I do two kinds of research. One is on what's called hidden champions, which is a term that comes from Germany, because Germany has the most SMEs with niche specialties, and the second most, and the most is Japan. Japan is the most, and also the oldest. I believe the oldest niche SMEs in Japan can be about 900 years or 1,000 years old that are still going, by the way. On average, they're over 100 years. And so what we do is we research and we want to understand what keeps them going over long periods of time, economic times, et cetera. And then the other thing that I'm researching is the growing entrepreneurial ecosystem of Japan. Who are the key players from startups to VCs to incubators and accelerators to government entities. We interview them, and so I'm going all over Japan with my what they call Zemi students, and then we interview the officials or the CEOs of these entities, and so that's part of my background. It's a little bit different, but I try to explain to people that what we bring to the table is that if you look at the history of startups, a lot of them have emerged from universities, right? So MIT has some of the most, the highest number of startups. I think second is Stanford. And so a lot of times what happens even here in Japan is these organizations or entities ignore universities, and it's still happening. And so I'm trying to bridge that. I'm trying to bridge that. And so the university that I work at, we have one degree program, and it's entrepreneurship, which is what I teach. And we have already had 30 startups, and I think about half of them have been really successful. We have our own venture fund, and I also teach entrepreneurship at Jose University's Global MBA program, and also at the University of Maryland Global Campus entrepreneurship program. So that's what I bring to the table, and hopefully I can share some insight that's a little bit different than the traditional information you might get. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Keep the mic. Yeah, the first question is going to go to you.
Hot potato.
No, yeah. So thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. So with a quick icebreaker, let's try to keep it maybe 2-3 sentences, just to kind of, because I want to get into the meat of the discussion, right? So I wanted to ask, like, kind of, what is your relationship with entrepreneurship, right? Like, what does it mean to you, or what is your relationship with entrepreneurship, right? In your own words.
Okay, I'll start. So I have my own company, so that's my third startup. My first one was when I was 21 years old, and I worked with what's called SCORE, if any of you heard that in the US, and it was useless, and I learned nothing from them, and I lost like $100,000 of my friend's money, and I thought, oh Jesus, there's got to be something out there. And that was during the time of Silicon Valley was just growing. I'm that old. There was no internet back then. Not that old. So I come from the understanding of what it used to be, what it is, and what it can be, and that's where I come from. And then, you know, of course, I have my own company as well.
Nice. For me, my real passion, I've realized after about a third of my life, is gardening and seeing stuff grow, transform, change, and the feeling of putting in hard work. Actually, first you have to make a plan, then you have to get the tools, and then you have to get your hands dirty in the soil. And then after like 6 to 9 months, you'll see this thing transform, and it's super tangible transformation, like this brown little plot of land, and then it's a lush garden. It's so satisfying for me. I don't really enjoy competing or taking risk, or I don't care about those things, but transformation. And entrepreneurship is a way to get that same feeling and make a little bit of money from doing it, or supporting entrepreneurs or building stuff. For me, it's sort of same material.
I think that's a really important question, and I'm really happy to be able to answer it. I believe that entrepreneurship is critical to a free market economy, which is the pillar of capitalism, which correctly executed is the best way to defend the rule of law and maintain peace and opportunity and a way to organize humans. When we haven't found a better way to do that yet, so it's critical to the way of life we enjoy.
Wow.
Yeah. Next question.
You know, I was just gonna say because I like it, but I mean, look, two things about me. I'm very much an idealist, and I like working with very passionate, smart people. And where do you find this, right? So startups are a great place. I come from a very different background. I actually come much more from that world. I was like an international relations major who wanted to save the world and joined the World Bank. Talk to everybody where they're like, don't do it, don't do it. Right? It's extremely bureaucratic. Well, sorry, no offense to anybody at the World Bank, but no, but like I founded the world of startups, and it was like drinking water from a fire hose. I loved it, and so I love supporting entrepreneurs and flirting with the idea myself.
We can all tell that you're the freest man here.
Was I? No filter.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks for answering that. Yeah, keep the money for now. So we're gonna just keep passing it. So yeah, I think we all kind of recognize that Japan is a pretty unique landscape, right? So kind of considering Japan's sort of like distinct and unique strengths, right? What do you think is kind of important for startups to leverage in this society to succeed and like foster innovation and entrepreneurship?
So I'll try to keep short. I'm gonna kind of pass this down, right? Because like, look, my personal sense here is like everything net. What's most important in startups is talent density, right? You need to have a group of very talented, driven, whatever people who are somewhat near the cutting edge of some sort of technology, some sort of trend, etc., and be able to leverage that and commercialize products, drive new user experiences, therefore value, right? The interesting thing about Japan, I think, in that context is that, as I think some people have referenced here, and many people here have felt, is that it's still in many ways, I think, a very insular market. Especially in terms of information, especially in terms of expertise. I mean, I'm sure in our various fields we felt the information gap from anything go from like 18 months to like in some cases 3-5 years. And so what that means is that there's a specific, like a unique market opportunity here, right, for translation of different technologies, products, whatnot, to the Japanese market. A lot of people have highlighted very different user behavior and whatnot, customer behavior preferences here that can be used as a moat. And so my take here is like, I think there's a case for people who can straddle both sides here. To to either tackle the Japanese market, right? I think there's still a lot of strong assets here, large market, see what you can do here, and also see if you can be smart about international expansion in other markets, and leveraging the momentum that you have here. But easily said, very hard to do in practice.
Thanks. Can you repeat the question?
So yeah, considering kind of the unique aspects of Japan, right? Like as a society, what do you think startups should leverage in order to kind of succeed in entrepreneurship
What should
and like foster innovation?
what should startups leverage in order to succeed in this market?
Yeah.
So these questions were briefed on the questions, right? And they lead into each other. So I just wanted to make sure. And I also want to make sure I answer this for the benefit of the audience. So audience, what's your interest? Are you students? Working in startups? Funding startups? Come talk to me. Working at corporate, but interested in the concept of startups. Okay, that's a pretty even split.
Half and half.
Yeah, that's about half and half. All right, so, well, for startups to be successful in the market, you have to create value. And the promise of a startup is that you do things better. You execute better. The promise of startups is not that you necessarily have fun. It's really hard work. And so last week we had Takeoff Tokyo, which was super fun. That happens like 3 times a year. The rest of the time you're like chained to your desk, working really, really hard. But it's really fun because you're tapping into your innate motivation, intrinsic motivation to do something. And like I related with my 1-year stint in the real corporate side, that was torture because although the work was easy, I didn't feel it was meaningful. So you have the ability to do something meaningful and to execute and be better at it. But the ability to execute better means that you are challenging the entrenched corporates, right?
Yeah.
So to use the Silicon Valley terminology, startups are generally gazelles,
Yeah.
and the incumbent corporates are what? Elephants. Elephants versus gazelles. That's the usual analogy used. So startups, they move faster, they're quick, they execute better. And elephants used to be gazelles, and they get entrenched in their ways and they solidify. Now, I think a common misperception in Japan is that the elephants are old and big. They've got a lot of people, and their staff are probably quite old. That's not necessarily the case, because some really big old corporations can be gazelles, and throughout Japanese history, they have. Some really big companies have executed really, really well. So it's just about being really efficient. And I think the promise, getting back to the question, the promise of startups, the opportunity for startups is to execute so well that you either inspire the elephants to change or you push them aside. And that is also the promise of a free market economy. Now in Japan, it's not executed very well. The market is extremely protectionist. It's not purely capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think it's on the verge of changing. I think we can unseat some of the government policies that have created the current structure in the near future. So I think it's a really exciting time for startups.
Evan, actually, I had one question for you,
Sure.
just before you pass the mic on. You mentioned some Japanese elephants have, acted as gazelles in the past. Like, which ones have come to mind for you?
Well, I don't have a top of mind example that I can share. I could reach for one, but I think the point is more that we can't write off the elephants, the existing corporations, as being completely incompetent. You know, they can change, they can evolve, they can innovate. So my point was just that it's not necessarily that they're big and they're old and maybe they're even, you know, a 300-year-old company. That's not necessarily the issue. The issue is simply mindset.
Makes sense. Yeah, because I was thinking personally, like Toyota, for example. I don't know if they're really nimble nowadays, but the Toyota production system was kind of an inspiration for a lot of other companies in the manufacturing industry, right? And I was kind of curious if that was one of the companies you thought of, but yeah.
I have more examples of this.
Yeah, let's
Probably one.
So I sometimes I think what I'm trying to do is in a sense a startup with the VC business model. So I have some ideas of advice I could share. I think the most specific one relates to if you're a foreign founder, and maybe there are a few of those in the room. I've felt and realized that the thing you're trying to do, there has to be a reason you're a foreigner trying to do it. If someone Japanese could do the same thing just as easily, just as well, there's no reason for a Japanese investor or maybe a Japanese client to take a risk working with a foreigner. The Japanese, in my experience, are very, very rational, logical. So as long as it makes sense, yeah, we can proceed, we can do this, but it has to make sense. So in my case, okay, we want to invest into startups in Japan. Why should I not work with a Japanese investor trying to do this? Well, because of the aging population, shrinking domestic market, we think we need to, build Japanese startups with products that can work outside of Japan. And if you want to understand what might work outside of Japan, you might need a foreign perspective. And they go, oh yeah, it makes sense. Probably only a foreigner could build this kind of fund, and given the aging, population problem, it's rational to try to build this type of fund. But if you're trying to do, I think it's imperative that you find that framing, and I think more or less any idea you could find that framing within which it makes you have an edge as a foreigner. Like, it's easier for me to do this because I'm a foreigner. My foreign perspective has a strategic value in this particular business. If you can't find that framing, I suspect you're better off trying another idea, because otherwise it may just end up, beating your head against a door that won't open. But I think more or less every idea you can find that framing to. But in general, I think when it comes to Japan, problem is not the startups, I think it's the investors, but we might come to that.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I was gonna say, one thing you could do is have a thick skin, because you're gonna get a lot of no's. One of the first businesses that I tried to do was at the beginning of the wave of wine that was taking over Japan. This might have been about 20 years ago. And even though my family owns a wine company, they weren't interested, right? They were like, we got our own thing. So got a lot of no's, and actually one company actually told us to get out. So, have a thick skin. Leverage that. Leverage your thick skin as a foreigner. And to answer the question that was given about how are the bigger companies able to be the gazelles, they themselves cannot be the gazelles, but they're producing the gazelles, right? So if you look at companies like Rakuten, they came from the big ones. So they developed the skills and mindset, and then they said, I can do this on my own. And then they went out and on their own did it. Or Recruit. Recruit has created a lot of ex-Recruit employees who have done very well on their own startups. So they themselves are not the gazelles, but they produce the gazelles.
Makes sense? So I will kind of make it random. Whoever wants to start answering, we can, we don't have to pass around that. But I think, Kenneth, you mentioned kind of talent density, I think was the term you used, right? So in terms of talent acquisition, right, what kind of strategies do you think have proven effective in Japan for startups to acquire the talent that they need? Especially if it's in kind of, very competitive fields, right, like AI or robotics. Whoever wants to answer this.
So I think that's a very good question, right? Because like, just quick survey here. I think see a lot of people from different countries. How many people have been asked, "Why are you here?" from people who are well-meaning, right? And I get that question very often. They're like, even from well-meaning Japanese friends and investors and sort of people, they're like, just go back to Silicon Valley, right? Or like, just go to Singapore, right? The very, very common sense, like rational thing to do, right? And for a lot of people. However, I have seen in recent years, especially like a couple of Japanese companies figure out how to attract, I think, great international talent, right? And of course, everybody here probably quite familiar with a lot of the attractions of Japan as a whole, good quality of life, kind of deep culture, yada yada yada. But usually that's not quite enough, right? So just speaking from my own experience at Moon Creative Lab, there is a formula that I think some larger companies have come around who have capital to execute on that, which is like basically what a lot of people are looking for is like an international environment that looks and feels good, working on maybe 70% US salaries, right? If you do that, you get fantastic people to relocate here. So I think, if you're familiar with like Woven, they've been able to bring in like basically thousands of people like on that thing. That's the same, very similar playbook. If you look at like big tech, right, Indeed, your Google's, whatever, lots of people happy to relocate to Japan. Now, whether or not they come into startups is another matter. But I think in the startup space, there's also a couple of examples of companies who have started to figure this out, right? So like Zeals is one that I've seen been able to start executing that a little bit better. You're seeing some people move into like executive rings. Mercari's been getting better and better at this as well. I'm sure everybody's seen their like job, applications, right? Descriptions around the board. I think another part of this that I would also emphasize is basically language market fit. Is like, I think experienced professionals, right? If they're good talent, they're looking for two things. First is things have to look and feel right, and they are also looking for social proof, right? So what I'm seeing with some newer startups here is like people using internationally familiar ATS systems. So they might use like Greenhouse, right? Instead of like some weird, a domestic solution or something like that, right? I think Zeals has started doing that. They advertise on places like LinkedIn a little bit more, right? The job descriptions sound and feel natural, right? Or like familiar to people, used to seeing those things elsewhere. And the interview process is familiar and whatnot. And so I think even domestic companies here, like your Cycles and whatnot, are getting a little bit better at this. Although it is a steep learning curve, and a lot of companies are, that I think biased towards comfort, and people who are familiar with Japan in terms of international hires tend to do not quite as well.
Could I ask very quickly, how important do you think perks such as
So how important do you think extra perks such as more time off or decent work hours are in the local talent's job decision-making process?
I think it's less important, right? Again, it depends on what target you're looking for. One thing that I've noticed too is like the talent pools in Japan tend to be quite siloed, which is pretty unique, right? Like big tech people and talent pools tend to stay in big tech. Startups tend to stay in startups. If it's like international startups with a local go-to-market team, you think of your LinkedIn's, your Stripes, your whatever, your TransferWise, having talked to those ones, they kind of stay in that sphere, right? Country manager is a little bit of a cognitive industry. I think relatively few people can bridge over to like pure startups and 0 to 1 stuff. And so what I think what matters most to people is just like it looks and feels right? I think for ambitious people, like the perks are only in service and looking and feeling right and like familiar, right? And demonstrating that you get it.
Be the best. That's the promise of startups. You can execute better at something than anybody else. So if you're the best at it, you're going to attract the right talent. And the best might mean that you provide work-life balance. So your team gets a good sleep. They can, go home at 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. or whatever it is, and they can come back fresh, and they can have focused bursts of extreme productivity, so that your per hour productivity is better than the incumbents, which is the worst in the developed world. Like Japan's per hour productivity is, what is it right now, 29 in the OECD nations? And you can execute, maybe you could implement digital technology. Japan's right now number 63 in the world at doing that, so there's room for improvement. Or maybe you're the best at accommodating people with childcare needs, at providing room for advancement, at not promoting people based on seniority, but on merit. Be the best at whatever it is you do. Maybe you're the most creative environment. Now, maybe you follow the Steve Jobs approach and you really believe that creativity makes good products. Maybe, is that an outdated example, maybe?
No, it's still applicable.
But just be the best, and you will execute people who want to be the best at whatever that is. Now, the examples that I've been using here, they sound really competitive, right? But you can compete in whatever niche it is. You might be the most creative environment. Maybe you only work once a week, whatever it is. But whatever it is that you do, create a culture that is the best at doing that, and then you will attract people to that culture.
Makes sense?
No. The only comment I have is, I agree. Whatever your startup is going to be, whatever your idea is going to be, find the right network that will help you grow. Because we'll talk about it later tonight, probably, but there's quite a lot of silos even within the startup ecosystem in Japan. Even though it seems to be fresh and new, depending on where you go, there's kind of a different concentration of specialties or people that are, interested in whatnot. So it's not a generalized ecosystem. It's a bit siloed.
And again, a follow-up question there. Are you doing yourself a service or a disservice by branding yourself as a startup? Are you better off if you just, hey, we're just a tech innovator, early stage tech innovator, and you stay away from the startup culture to talk to a way larger pool of traditional Japanese doers?
Dude, super interesting question, right? Because as somebody who's deeply embedded in the startup scene, I have to say here, startups are a scene, right? And that comes with a lot of negatives as well, where you have people who are here, to hang out, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But that might not be aligned with business building and trying to make money and build a good product. So some of the best examples of I actually know it's a double-edged sword, right? I think it depends a lot on the industry you're working on. So I'm just gonna use an example of a startup run by a friend that's growing like gangbusters. It's called Autogram, and what they do is they develop construction site project management software. And I've never seen the founder anywhere near a startup event, right? None of the people he's hired are really startup people. They've grown at 300% a year, right? And they've got organic growth throughout, the Middle East, Africa, I think some in Europe and whatnot, Southeast Asia. They've done extremely well. They've gotten some inbound interest from top international VC funds as well. Won't name any names, but they're completely uninterested in startups. And this is a founder who was dedicated enough to this that during his MBA program, he spent 6 months just working for free for construction companies in Japan to build those relationships and get to know them. He's hey, and obviously he didn't launch cold, right? So instead of hanging out with tech people or startup people, he hung out with his clients, novel idea, right? And so I think there are great people like that, right? If you're doing something that obviously DevTools or something that just has something to do with other startups, or you need people who like that kind of environment to build your business, which in fact I don't think is most companies, then you would benefit a lot from this branding and doing startups. What I will like add the caveat though is like because startups work in a specific way, incentive structures work differently. You know, very few people are familiar with like stock-based compensation, ESOPs, whatever. There is still benefit from working with people who have kind of been through it, and then you have to brand yourself as a startup, right? A lot of times to get those people.
Yeah, and on that note, I wanted to ask you, Joe, about this. So, in terms of the branding issue that startups have sometimes, right? I think it's especially prominent in Japan. So we'll kind of wrap this up with your comments on this, but and if anyone in the audience also has comments on this, would be interested to hear this. But I found that for some folks, like especially Japanese folks, they may see the instability of working at a startup as a highly negative thing, right? And working with universities, like, have you noticed a difference in like how your students approach like searching their first job? Because so my first job out of university was at a startup,
Right.
and I was highly biased toward working at a small company, and I hesitated to even accept the offer that I got from Google after that startup. So I was like, I don't think I'm really fit for working in a large company, right? So what do you see in terms of students here, or just even like folks that you work with in general?
Yeah, two things. The original motto of our university was zero employment, meaning we wanted all 800